Rudyard Kipling left Tilbury to sail to Bombay in September 1882. He was 16, one of thousands of young people sailing away every year to take advantage of a world brimming with new possibilities. The British Empire was at its peak. It would never be as powerful or as confident again. India was its beating, burning heart. Like so many others, Kipling was a teenager without the education or the wealth or the connections to stand much chance of making it back home. He was seizing the opportunities of a new world. Just 7 years later, he was to sail back to London, lionised as one of the most famous and celebrated writers in the English language. But today, he's unfashionable, and I think misunderstood. People think of him as a stuffy reactionary, at best politically incorrect, at worst an apologist for all the ills of the British Empire. But the writer I know and love is more complex. In truth, the young Kipling was an outsider, and even something of a rebel. This was a teenager, drawn to the dark side, and in colonial India, he broke every rule in the book. Experimenting with mind-altering drugs, looking for sex where he shouldn't, and writing about his experiences with unparalleled honesty in some of the most original and innovative stories ever written. But it was not a picture of imperial India the colonialists wanted to read.
In his rebellion, which is really what it was, he does expose the dirty side of British India.
As a writer and a former soldier, Kipling has always fascinated me. Now, I want to go back and find out how this extraordinary rite of passage transformed the teenage Kipling, and how in the process he changed our understanding of India forever. What must it have been like to disembark at Bombay on the evening of the 18th of October, 1882? Kipling had lived here before as a child, but had been sent away for 11 miserable years. Now, he was coming home to his beloved India. But Kipling later wrote that he returned to India as a prince entering his kingdom. And the contrast with the grey monotony of his childhood years in Southsea couldn't have been any greater.
There was the noise, the sudden heat, like opening an oven door. There were the smells, there was the brilliant colours, saris, fuchsia pink, blue, emerald green, and masses of people.
But Kipling's destination was to an outpost 900 miles away, in Lahore, where his family lived. A frontier town ruled over by just 70 colonials. Lahore had been in British hands for less than 35 years. It was the last major Indian city to become part of the empire. But although they were far from home, the Victorians who came here were keen to create a very distinctive Little England in the Punjab.
There are two quite different Lahores. There's the civil lines, which is where the British live. This is well laid out, with nice big bungalows and with large gardens, and everybody's living there very safely. And then there's a wall, and then within that wall is the old city. And this is a place of squalor and dirt and disease, where the people are living cheek by jowl, and it's a place where the British do not go.
Ignoring the culture of India, the British here were obsessed with preserving the rituals of home, at work and at play, in what they ate, and of course, in what they wore. gets this sense with the British in India of a constant fight for standards in dress. It's part of their fight against the country itself.
It certainly took on a psychological aspect. It was partly a fight against the country itself and partly an expression of being the ruling caste. They actually did change for dinner when they were in the jungle. It wasn't a fallacy. They were keeping up standards in front of the Indians.
Lahore had a Victorian railway and an elegant town hall. It had museums and public gardens that equalled those in Brighton or Leeds. And it even had a school of art, where Kipling's father was the principal. But Lockwood Kipling was very different from his colonial peers. Instead of turning away from Indian culture, he studied it.
Rudyard Kipling's father was one of the key champions of Indian art and craft movement in whole of India. One of his daughters said about Lockwood Kipling that he knew something about everything and everything about something. And it is only logical that his son, with his literary sort of kind of genius in him, would be inspired, and his imagination will be kind of, provoked by the kind of images that he sort of kind of confronted and lived with in India.
His father was an important influence on him, but Kipling wasn't an academic, and his first challenge was to find a job. Luckily, there was an opening that would suit him well, working on the local newspaper, the Civil and Military Gazette. And Charles Allen's great-grandfather was the man who gave him the job.
My grandfather, I suppose you could say he was the Murdoch of his age in India. He had two newspapers, one, the Pioneer, which was the biggest newspaper in India, and then there was a strange little newspaper right out in Lahore, right out on the frontier, which really, the Civil and Military Gazette, and that sums it up exactly, it was for a tiny community of civil administrators and military men. And that really was its clientele. But it had to have an editor and it had to have an assistant editor. So young Ruddy, at 16, he's appointed the second most important man on the newspaper. And he's in charge with putting it to bed every night. And it's an astonishing responsibility, you could say, for a 16-year-old.
Dropped into the deep end of newspaper publishing, without any training, Kipling had to learn quickly to write and sub-edit, up against tight deadlines. Kipling would later describe his time at the CMG as his 7 years hard. Hard labour, perhaps, but a fantastic apprenticeship for an aspiring writer. To begin with, Kipling wasn't allowed to write about the real India. He was confined instead to the narrow world of the Anglo-Indians. Like a cub reporter in a home county's small town, he was first assigned to write up accounts of gymkhanas, tea parties, and polo.
Why will Lahore not officially recognise a gymkhana? On Thursday evening, for instance, the attendance was of the thinnest, and the ladies present might have been counted on one's fingers. Beyond comparing symptoms of cold and influenza, or discussing the comparative merits of quinine pills versus quinine raw, we have little left to talk about.
Kipling's earliest reports reflected back to the Anglo-Indians in Lahore the image of themselves that they liked the best, confirming that they were more British than the British back home. Their social centre was here, the Punjab Club. The club was an all-male preserve for Europeans only, and there were fewer than 100 people eligible in the whole of Lahore. Kipling wrote of the club rather disparagingly. It was a place where bachelors mostly gathered to eat meals of no merit, with men whose merits they knew well. Still only a teenager, Kipling was mixing with some of the most important men in the Punjab, but he found their company dreary. There was no one his own age, and the other members felt that young Rudyard had a caddishly dirty tongue. He would later write, "There is no society in India as we understand the word. There are no books, no pictures, no conversations worth listening to for recreation's sake. No one talks lightly and amusingly as they do in England. They don't seem to realise any of the beauties of life. Perhaps they haven't the time." This is obviously gentlemen members only. The Punjab Club is still open for business. But of course, the members are now Pakistani. And 12 years ago, they admitted the first woman, journalist Nelufar Bakhtir.
So here we are. Kipling writes in his memoirs that the club became the whole of my outside world because he would toil at the offices of the Civil and Military Gazette and then come here at the club for his dinners. He would be heckled mercilessly at times for what was published in the paper, even though at that time he was just an assistant editor and he really had no control over the editorial policy. Kipling would have to apologize for the mistakes that his editor made, and the editor was married, so he never used to come to the club.
So Kipling bore
But
the
Kipling,
brunt of it.
yes, he bore the brunt of it. He spent only 5 of his 70 years in Lahore, but those 5 years were extremely crucial in his development as a writer. And all of this happened because he had the innate curiosity, as it were, to step out of the bubble in which he had first entered. Here were the people sitting in their clubs and really not bothering to look out of their window, as it were, while this whole colourful sort of circus is going past, and they are completely immune to it.
It wasn't just lack of interest that was keeping the ruling class locked away in the club. It was also fear. The Indian Mutiny, which had brought colonial rule in India to the brink of collapse, was only a generation away. To maintain order, 30,000 soldiers were now stationed across India. Lahore was one of the most important military outposts. Bored by the old men in the club, the young soldiers were the only men of Kipling's age in the city. They were to become an important inspiration for his writing. Kipling was fascinated by the military. It's been suggested that he always regretted his poor eyesight prevented him from going to Sandhurst. So it's no surprise that he was impressed by and enjoyed socialising with the junior officers who were stationed here in the Lahore fort, waiting to be deployed up to the northwest frontier provinces. These were men with exciting stories to tell, and Kipling writes of long, hot, drunken evenings that went on late into the night. The soldiers on fort duty or confined to barracks had a hard time of it in the Indian summer. Boredom, disease and heat could claim more victims than a skirmish on the Afghan frontier. Reporting for the CMG, Kipling wrote about fights between soldiers ending in them killing each other, arising from temper in the heat. And in his early stories, Kipling would write of soldiers cracking up with the boredom and isolation of Indian barracks life. Kipling's first exploration of this subject was in some verse written just over a year after arriving in India. In Kipling's poem, On Fort Duty, the soldiers cooped up here in the Lahore fort dream of action on the frontier, where the passes ring with rifles and the sound of Afghan raids.
I look across the ramparts, to the northward and the snow, to the far Cherat cantonments, but alas, I cannot go. Oh, it's everlasting gun drill, and 8 o'clock parades, it's cleaning up of mortars, likewise of carronades, while the passes ring with rifles and the noise of Afghan raids. And I look across the ramparts, to the river broad and grey, and I think of merry England, where the festive horse guards play.
Kipling may have been impressed by the officers, but it was the ordinary soldiers he was really interested in. Unusually for someone of his background at the time, Kipling socialised with private soldiers, and over beer he studied the way they talked and the way they thought.
I think we've also got to remember that young Kipling is an outsider. Look at him, he's a runt, he's very short, he's myopic. He can hardly see without his glasses. And on top of that, he's dyspraxic. He's totally disjointed. He keeps falling off his horse. He can't play sports. You know, he really is an outsider. The people he admires most of all are the upright British soldiers, the officers in particular. But in that process, he learns about this other community, this other group of outsiders, the ordinary soldier.
Kipling would later immortalise these men as Tommy Atkins and Danny Deever, and his three musketeers, Leroyd, Mulvaney and Ortheris. Kipling seemed to get along with the soldiers, but whether or not he got along with the officers is another matter. One member of the general staff would write disparagingly of Kipling that he was disapproved of as being mutinous and above his station. Polo is still played in Lahore, and while there are no British soldiers here, there are plenty of old soldiers from the Pakistani army who know Kipling's work well. Kipling loved soldiers and he loved adventures. I was saying, Major Miles, you had the sort of adventures, by the sound of it, that Kipling would have written a story about.
I was bitten by the most poisonous snake in the desert. I survived. I had 3 bullets in my body. I survived. I was missing belief killed. I survived. Then I was supposed to be killed by these muktis and Indians. And you know how the muktis did it. They would take your eyes out, they'd cut your ears, and then that's how they killed you. I had been told 3 times that your time is tomorrow. In the morning, that's what's going to happen to you. So by all standards, I should have been dead long time ago. But if somebody up there likes me, you know.
You're the unbreakable soldier.
Can't do anything to me.
I'm here trying to follow in young Kipling's footsteps. And it's strange because his reputation today is maybe not as popular as it once was. I think people think that he represents the part of the British Empire which is bad. But actually there was
No. It's you see, as we're growing, the generations are changing, and old stories go away, they die. But if you ask older people, my age or his age, well, they all know Kipling. They all know he was associated with us. He was very much a part of this country for 7-8 years.
Spending time with soldiers made Kipling more determined than ever to get out from behind his desk. His chance came at the age of 18. He was made special correspondent for the Gazette and allowed to go out and report on the real India for the first time.
So soon as my paper could trust me a little, and I had behaved well at routine work, I was sent out. Communal riots under the shadow of the Mosque of Wazir Khan, visits of viceroys to neighbouring princes on the edge of the great Indian desert, reviews of armies expecting to move against Russia next week.
Given license to travel and report across India, a new world was opening up. No longer confined to writing reports of gymkhanas, Kipling enjoyed the real freedom of being a journalist for the first time. As the outsider looking in, making sense of what he sees.
He seems to be so good at going out, looking at a subject, studying it from all its aspects, asking the right questions, finding the essence of that particular skill, that particular subject, and then keeping it in his head. He does have, like all the great writers, an extraordinary memory. All the information he needs is tucked away there, and he brings it out. You know, he learned how to be short and to be brief and to be accurate. And those qualities helped him in great stead. The other thing, he had a huge gift for observation.
As a writer, he was finding his subject and growing fast. But Kipling's opportunities for travel came to an end when the weather turned hot. Like most Europeans, his editor would flee from the unbearable Lahore summers, taking trains to much cooler hill stations. Kipling was stuck in the city, turning out the Civil and Military Gazette, sometimes single-handedly. He was isolated and alone, and his nervous disposition started to get the better of him. Often sick and terrified of catching a fatal illness, he couldn't sleep. His night terrors grew worse, and he started pacing about outside, increasingly curious about the city at night. Inevitably, he was drawn like a magnet to the medieval city of Inner Lahore and the wall that separated east from west. It was a dividing line that few English people had ever crossed.
He hated the hot weather. He hated being alone. His parents that he's been living with have disappeared to the hills, and he's alone in this huge house, and he starts to have breakdowns. He's really, really frightened that he's going to catch a disease and die, or that he's going to overheat and die. And he walks from room to room. He gets his servants to throw water over him, and he cannot get any sleep. And this is part of what makes him take up his night walks when he starts to wander in the night.
What he found when he crossed the wall was a hidden city that never sleeps.
Often the night got into my head, and I would wander till dawn in all manner of odd places. Liquor shops, gambling and opium dens, wayside entertainments such as puppet shows, native dances, or in and about the narrow gullies under the mosque of Wazir Khan for the sheer sake of looking. Sometimes the police would challenge, but I knew most of their officers. Having no position to consider, and my trade enforcing it, I could move at will in the fourth dimension.
Having crossed the barrier that separated the two cultures, Kipling discovered, as he wrote, that much of real Indian life goes on in the hot weather nights. It wasn't just in Kipling's time that Europeans didn't really come into the walled city. We've been advised to be very careful when we're wandering about, and even in the space of this little exploration, we've picked up a policeman wielding an AK-47 who's clearing people off behind us. It feels quite unusual to have a sense of people watching you in that regard. And it must have been what Kipling felt like when he first came down here, as possibly the only white face that most people had ever seen. What Kipling saw here fascinated him.
The yard-wide gullies into which the moonlight cannot struggle are full of mystery, stories of life and death, an intrigue of which we, the mal-abiding, open-windowed, purdulous English, know nothing and believe less. Properly exploited, our city would yield a store of novels.
And as this teenager started to break one taboo, others would follow. It wasn't long before he began another form of experimentation. In the middle of one particularly stifling night, on September the 16th, 1884, Kipling was woken with terrible stomach pains. His manservant brought him an opium pipe to relieve the pain. Kipling describes the effect. Presently, I felt the cramps in my leg dying out, and then my tummy rested. And a minute or two later, it felt as though I fell through the floor. He continued to rely on drugs in the form of opium, morphine, and Indian hemp to get him through Lahore's hot summer nights.
The dense, wet heat that hung over the face of land like a blanket prevented all hope of sleep. It was impossible to sit still in the dark, empty, echoing house and watch the punka beat the dead air. So at 10 o'clock of the night, I set my walking stick on end in the middle of the garden and waited to see how it would fall. It pointed directly down the moonlit road that leads to the City of Dreadful Night.
The City of Dreadful Night kept drawing Kipling back in. The opium dens have now gone, but inside the medieval city, it can still sometimes be possible to recapture some of the drug-fueled excitement of Kipling's Lahore. I've come to a Sufi shrine to see a festival of drumming and dancing. It's the sort of mystical side of religion here that even in Kipling's day was noted for being quite wild. It has a reputation even today of people getting spiritually and also physically off their heads. And the atmosphere is a little bit like coming to a festival. We've been accosted in the street by people who come up to us and said, we're very excited that you're here. You're going to see the real Pakistan. This is a Pakistan of peace and love, not the Pakistan of international terrorism. This, the dancing, the excitement, this is apparently the real Pakistan. And I can't help but think this is probably the Lahore that Kipling found and that excited him and that probably inspired some of his own nocturnal activities. The drumming, which is amazing, and the crowd sort of building up into this chant, a bit like before the biggest act at a night at a club comes on. And over in the dark corners, you can see people rolling up. But in the main centre, everyone's kind of getting ready into this really frenetic dance. An anonymous article in the CMG, attributed to Kipling, seems to describe an opium trip.
Here you are alone, utterly alone on the verge of a waste of moonlit sand. Hundreds and thousands of miles away lies a small silver pool, not bigger than a splash of rainwater. A stone is dropped into its bosom, and as the circles spread, the silver lines broaden from east to west and rush up with inconceivable rapidity to the level of your eyes. You shudder and attempt to fly.
You think of Timothy Leary and drugs and awakening of consciousness, you really feel that something like this happens with this youngster. This process of hallucination opens up his mind, and it stays open. It's almost as if he's kind of thrown off all his fears, having gone through this process. And he seems to now to write from this time onwards with a great freedom. But in particular, he seems to revel in the squalor and the dirt and the disease. And he says, I am in love with India. I am in love with all the dirt and the smells and the sounds. And this is a complete change in attitude. And he even says, I now feel like a cock crowing on a dunghill, that this is my empire and that I can write about this land. I really feel like a king in his own country.
Kipling's experience of opium inspired his first published short story, the tale of an opium addict eking out his last days in a drug den.
I've seen so many come in and out, and I've seen so many die here on the mats that I should be afraid of dying in the open now. I've seen some things that people would call strange enough, but nothing is strange when you're on the black smoke, except the black smoke. And if it was, it wouldn't matter.
The Gate of the Hundred Sorrows is the story that changed everything for Kipling. I think it's the first time he realizes the power of fiction, as opposed to journalism, to tell us truths. It's the first of his tales of outcasts and derelicts, Europeans who've slipped through the cracks in India. It's the first example of his original vision of the dark side of Indian life. And it's all the more remarkable that he managed to publish it in the Civil and Military Gazette. Opium gave Kipling access to layers of Indian life which the British had so willfully ignored. Kipling wrote, "Underneath our excellent administrative system, under the piles of reports and statistics, the thousands of troops, the doctors, runs wholly untouched and unaffected the life of the people of the land. A life as full of impossibilities and wonders as the Arabian Nights. Immediately outside of our own English life is the dark and crooked and fantastic and wicked and awe-inspiring life of the native. To understand this dark India and conquer one's fear of it meant putting one's prejudices to one side and reaching out." It wasn't just drugs that were enticing Kipling to a darker, more exciting side of Indian life. Here, in the Shadara Gardens, prostitutes plied their trade amongst the tombs and in the shadows, and the young Kipling, only 18 at the time, escaped the city in search of adventure and distraction.
He is a teenager, and his hormones are raging, and he's a very horny young man. And he wants to, you almost feel his hormones are dragging him into the city.
We know this from a series of coded entries in his journals and letters to friends. 21st of August, 1885, at the height of the heat, when most of the Anglo-Indians would have been away in Shimla, Kipling writes, "Usual philander in the gardens, home to count the risks of my resolution," clearly worried about the after effects of his encounter. Elsewhere, one of his codes, 5 initials, WRWMT, whatever that meant or whoever that was, a thoroughly satisfactory conclusion. In a letter to a friend at the same time, he writes, "I'm no more capable of abandoning my writing than I can put aside the occasional woman, which is good for health and the softening of ferocious manners. It is my amusement, and like all amusements, the nicer for being discouraged." Kipling may have enjoyed the illicit nature of his encounters, but it's clear the other men of the station knew of his wanderings in the old city, and they didn't approve. One of them saying at the time, "Everyone thought he was going for a mucker with the harlotries therein."
There's no doubt at all that one of the ways that young Rudyard Kipling learns about India is through the prostitutes of Lahore. The phrase that we all now use, the oldest profession in the world, it comes from Kipling's. When we talk about prostitutes in Lahore, we're actually talking about a very sophisticated group of women. They're more like the geishas of Japan. They're there to entertain men. And so they entertain them with music and dancing. They have poetry. And the young men would go to prostitutes and sit at their court, as it were, and swap stories. They would smoke bhang, and they would recite poetry to each other and listen to music. And young Kipling breaks into that circle. And he writes with huge sympathy about these women.
The girls in question would have been in these balconies?
Yes, indeed. There were entertainers, Patrick, whose function was to both, for example, recite poetry or music. They were all talented as singers, as dancers. So it was a wider range of services they offered than simply physical gratification.
This feels to me a little sanitized now. It doesn't quite have the edge that a proper red light district would have.
Yes, well, red light districts are not necessarily proper, but well, on the assumption of being improper. Yeah. When you think about it, Kipling's own writing, and don't forget he was writing in the Victorian time, and then prudery was the mantra. There was an element of sanitization in his writing, and so it was quite understandable that whatever he said would have elliptical meanings, and inevitably, today, most of the people who are the denizens of this place use this as their offices, but they live elsewhere.
But it's still striking that we've got the huge mosque right here and then the red light district on its lap.
Yes, indeed. The court used to be here and the residences were on the other side. I think it was probably an element of temptation. If you could resist temptation, then why not?
Do you think it was part of Lahore which made it easier for him to do that? Had he been somewhere like Bombay, there'd have been more of a temptation to stick with the English.
Had he been in Bombay, he would have been much more circumscribed in his ability to move around the city, and certainly at the levels that he wanted to savor Lahore. The stories that he came up with in Lahore were obviously born of his own personal experience and born of his personal investigation into areas that young boys of that age, young men of that age, and particularly English boys, were not really exposed to.
So in a way it was quite felicitous that not only did Kipling arrive here at this age where he was open to all these adventures, but Lahore was a city that was open to being adventured in.
It is the perfect marriage for him. He was in the right place at the right time, and Lahore, one has to be honest, found its voice.
Whilst Kipling enjoyed taking a walk on the wild side in the walled city, when he came to write about similar transgressions, the results were invariably much darker. Beyond the Pale is the story of Trejago, an Englishman who, not unlike Kipling, knew too much and saw too much. Stumbling through the walled city one night, Trejago finds himself in a dark alley at a dead end, beguiled by a beautiful singing voice. The voice turns out to belong to Bisesa, a widow of only 15, with whom Trejago begins an extraordinary love affair.
That night was the beginning of many strange things, and of a double life so wild that Trejago today sometimes wonders if it were not all a dream.
Trejago returns to the walled city for the 5th time in 3 weeks, desperate for a sign from his lover. Finding himself underneath the same grating from which he first heard her beautiful singing, he shouts and is answered. To his horror, 2 arms are thrust through the grating, hands cut off, revealing bloody stumps. As he recoils, a spear is thrust at him, missing him by a fraction but wounding him in the groin. Trejago limps off into the night, cursing his lost love. In Kipling's world, despite his own adventures, it invariably ends in tragedy when his characters cross the limits of what he knowingly refers to as decent society.
This young man has broken a taboo. He has fallen in love with a native woman from the red light district, and it's going to end in tragedy. And these stories nearly always do end in tragedy. But this is the first man to write about this. Here is a European writing about love across the racial divide.
Characters like Trejago are no longer the hopeful young men arriving from England to make their fortune. India has changed them, just as it was changing Kipling. He was starting to see the contradictions and the tragedies of the Raj. Then, in 1885, just as Kipling was starting to find his subject in Lahore, he was diverted and given an opportunity to observe Anglo-Indian high society up close. He was sent by the Gazette to be the special correspondent for the summer season at the hill town of Shimla. The posting would allow him to get under the skin of the ruling elite and explore a world that was as strange as that of the walled city. It would offer a new direction for him as a writer of short stories. Kipling would take the train from Lahore to Umballa and then a horse and cart up the steep mountain road to Shimla. Sadly, these days you can't take the train from Pakistan to India. I've had to come across the land border crossing at Wagga. I'm coming up on the lush foothills of the Himalayas now. Must have been an incredibly welcome sight to Kipling and the other Europeans, escaping the dusty plains and looking forward to getting up out of the heat. In 1903, they finally built a railway up to Shimla. I'm going to take the train rather than take my chances with a horse and cart. Perched 7,000 feet up in the Himalayas, Shimla was the summer capital of the British Raj, and every spring, hundreds of civil servants, clerks and administrators made the 1,200-mile journey from Calcutta to rule India in a more temperate climate. One viceroy regarded this mountain retreat as a preposterous place. That the capital of the Indian Empire should be thus hanging by its eyelids to the side of a hill is too absurd. Shimla was an exclusive world of expensive guest houses and hotels. Like all the hill stations, it was designed to be an oasis of Englishness, with home county-style architecture, rose gardens, picnics, lawn tennis and croquet.
Simla was probably the most English town in India. All the houses were sort of, I think I can best describe them as Tudor beaten, although they did have corrugated iron roofs. The flowers in the garden were English flowers, irises, sweet peas, roses. There was afternoon tea, log fires when you first went there. Everything was as English as it could be. And the cathedral was English-looking. People quite often got married there.
Unlike Lahore, with its small, stuffy world of 70 administrators, this was a bustling playground for the cream of Anglo-Indian society.
It was the court, wasn't it, where deals were done and where there was an enormous amount of the kind of life that you do have in a court. Balls, for example, balls and parties and people paying visits on each other and it being important who comes and visits you and who doesn't. And really the top of the tree is if you can be intimate with the Viceroy, the Queen's representative and her family, which Kipling's parents were, of course.
Raja Basan is a writer and historian who was an expert on the British in Shimla during the Raj. What was this place like in Kipling's day?
For one, the number of people would have been perhaps a 50th of what they are there now.
What would that have been in the 1880s?
Maybe about 20,000 people, and of that, maybe 3,000 or 4,000 Europeans and the rest Indians.
And this would have been the main thoroughfare for the British in Kipling's day. This is where they rode up and down.
Absolutely, absolutely.
The Anglo-Indians who couldn't make it to Shimla in the season were dying to know what was happening there, and Kipling sent regular reports on the festivities to the Civil and Military Gazette.
This week's list of amusements includes the usual Monday pop, a dance at Government House on Wednesday, 2 nights theatricals, a variety entertainment at the Gaiety Theatre this afternoon, and the trade ball at Benmore tonight.
Amateur theatricals were a high point of the Shimla season, and here at the Gaiety Theatre, Kipling appeared in a French farce called A Scrap of Paper, though one observer described his performance as horrid and vulgar.
I'm sure you do, as far as I'm concerned.
Today, the theatre still performs every other play in English.
Leave it. Out of my way, you betting department gigolo.
Squirrel, squirrel. Look what you've done to my squirrel.
Get out before I call the manager.
Amateur dramatics played an important role in British Indian life, beyond just giving vent to the frustrated and no doubt misplaced theatrical ambitions of the bored wives. Kipling enjoyed acting because it allowed him to get close to women. Theatre, whether it was putting on a play in an officer's mess or in a purpose-built venue like this one in Shimla, was really one of the only chances within the confines of the Victorian society that the British imposed here, where men and women could get close for flirting and romance. After his first stay in Shimla, Kipling writes, "The month was a round of picnics, dances and theatricals and so on, and I flirted with the bottled-up energy of a year on my lips." While Shimla had the outward appearance of English respectability, in fact, it was a hotbed of intrigue and scandal. The town was a celebrated destination for the fishing fleet, girls who had travelled from Britain on the lookout for husbands, and for its grass widows, wives who could misbehave while their husbands worked down on the plains.
Simla was really full of grass widows because anybody who could afford it sent their wife and children, they sent them up to the hills so they didn't have to suffer the horrible hot weather in the plains. And most people were between about 25 and 45. And when they went up to Simla, there were these attractive young women. There were the officers who were coming up on leave. They'd come up on 3 weeks' leave. And there they were in this town with loads of proximity and husbands not there. You can imagine. Lady Reading once described Simla as a place where every Jack has someone else's Jill.
Young, unmarried, white, junior members of the administration and the military could go and do what's called poodle faking, which is to make love to the married wives. Now, their husbands are in the plains. We have this great phrase, duty and red tape, that's life down in the plains. Picnics and adultery, that's life up in the hills. And there's a huge contrast. Standards start to slip up in the hills. You can get away with it. And Kipling sees it as a paradise. And he says, this is like Elysium. You know, this is where the gods live. Everything goes here.
I am the very model of a modern Major General. Life, information, vegetable, animal, and mineral.
Kipling was able to rub shoulders with the power elite of British India, at work and at play. And the pretensions and foibles of their world would provide fertile material for his fiction.
I am very well acquainted too with matters mathematical. I understand.
At first, he was intoxicated by it, describing it as a place of glamour, wine, and witchery.
With many cheerful facts about the square of the hypotenuse.
The Mall was the place to be seen, and every afternoon Kipling would promenade here with the other Anglo-Indians, picking up political and social gossip for the newspaper.
This is where the world and its dog came to eat the air. Hava Khana.
Hava Khana, eating the air.
Eating the air.
And that was their promenade.
Clean, fresh air. Throw in a few flirtations for good measure. It would make a good promenade.
There was even a part of town known as Scandal Point. So this was the central hub of gossip for the whole of Shimla.
Absolutely. This is where all the townspeople gathered, especially the women, with the traffic jam of rickshaws all crowding this place, exchanging scandal, and all these elegantly dressed middle-aged ladies trying to figure out who's going to run off with whom, who would like to run off with whom.
And the way Kipling presents it, it's not the kind of conception of Victorian society we have. I mean, there was a lot of sexual intrigue. It seems much more free than we would imagine these days.
It most certainly was. If anything, Simla was a steaming place.
But after 3 months of what he called the gay season in the hills, Kipling was beginning to see through it. Always more comfortable as an outsider, he was now turning what he saw into biting satirical short stories.
Simla is the place where people let their hair down, but even Rudyard Kipling realizes that actually it's a kind of false society. It's not really genuine. And he very quickly gets jaded by it, and it's very fascinating. He, as a youngster, thought he could, this was going to be paradise. But he very quickly turns his pen. His pen becomes very waspish, and he starts to criticize this society more and more, to the extent that the stories he writes about Simla society are really, they're letting the side down terribly.
There was a commissioner in Shimla in those days, an ugly man, the ugliest man in Asia with 2 exceptions. His name was Sagat, Bar Sagat, Anthony Bar Sagat, and 6 letters to follow. Departmentally, he was one of the best men the government of India owned. Socially, he was like unto a blandishing gorilla. Mrs. Hauksbee was clever, witty, brilliant, and sparkling beyond most of her kind, but possessed of many devils of malice and mischievousness. She could be nice, though, even to her own sex, but that is another story.
These are very thinly veiled portraits of quite important people. He must have had balls to write as he did about them.
Of steel. All of Kipling's little stories are true. And I think here it again comes into Kipling as a writer. His ability to sort of take off from real-life situations. Simla is perhaps a perfect case in point where he was able to do that.
Kipling's disillusionment with Shimla comes through in many of the satirical short stories of life there during the summer season. And they're different in style to the other stories he was writing at the time.
What I think I've understood more clearly since coming out here is that Kipling's real genius was in getting close to his subject. Perhaps that was because of his grounding as a journalist. He writes the common soldier so well because he spent these long hours chatting, drinking beer with the soldiers stationed in Lahore. He writes the walled city well because he was one of the few Europeans who really explored it. And he's able to portray with a slightly acid tongue the British in Shimla because he was part of that society.
Many of Kipling's stories were published alongside his journalism in the Civil and Military Gazette. But it wasn't until 1887, when he was 21, that he started grouping them with new and more ambitious pieces into a single book. Its title, Plain Tales from the Hills, was apposite. These were deceptively simple stories that aimed to tell readers about life in Anglo-India as it really was.
Kipling liked to head out of town on horseback, visit the rural villages and see the real India. One such trip gave him the idea for the short story Lispeth, in which a young Englishman falls from his horse and is rescued by a beautiful hill girl.
When a hill girl grows lovely, she is worth travelling 50 miles over bad ground to look upon. Lispeth had a Greek face, one of those faces people paint so often and see so seldom.
The hill girl, a convert to Christianity, falls passionately in love with the Englishman and declares her intention to marry him, much to the horror of the missionaries who raised her.
The betrayal of Lispeth is treated sympathetically by Kipling, and the English are portrayed as untrustworthy. Contrary to the received idea of Kipling as the bigoted Victorian, here it is the West that lets down the East. Only 8 pages long, Lispeth is a story that retains its power to unsettle. It was a provocative opening to his first book. Grouped together, the stories that follow, of adultery, loneliness and betrayal, did not add up to a flattering portrait of the Raj.
I don't think people knew what they were getting. In India, they were shocked by what he said. There was the sense that he'd let the side down and that he shouldn't have published the stories. And, you know, the Viceroy's telling Mrs. Kipling, oh, you really shouldn't have let your son do these stories. And I think people were very startled when that book came out because they were so subversive. They were so cynical.
In describing the realities of Anglo-Indian experience, in writing Plain Tales from the Hills, nothing was taboo. Kipling knew that some who came to find a new life in India found despair instead. Suicides were not uncommon, but always covered up. In Thrown Away, a young soldier new to India fails to cope because he doesn't seem to understand that India is a country where you shouldn't take anything too seriously. After he blows his brains out, his senior officer has to bury the body, covering up the evidence and pretending to his family back home that he died of cholera.
Kipling knew all about what happened to people when they were young and new to the country. To survive, he seems to be saying, you had to live by a new moral code. The real India was unfamiliar and threatening, not that the fools back home understood that. They were fed made-up stories of honour and bravery. Thrown Away is one of the few plain tales from the hills that was never published in the Civil and Military Gazette, and it marks an important change. This dark, brilliant story, proving Kipling so different from the reactionary he's made out to be, was written not just for the Anglo-Indians, but the armchair imperialists back in Britain.
Plain Tales didn't make Kipling popular with the British in India, and as word about the new stories spread, and he grew less respectful towards his hosts, his Indian education was was coming to an end.
His proprietor, George Allen, starts to get pretty worried, to the extent that eventually Kipling is too hot to handle. He's being so rude about people like the Viceroy, the Commander-in-Chief, British society in general, that Allen basically says to him, look, young Kipling, I think it's time you went to England. We can't handle you here.
7 years after he had first arrived, Kipling went back to Lahore to say goodbye to his family and to reflect on an extraordinary 7 years. I've had a good time. I've tasted success and the beauty of money. I've mixed with fighters and statesmen, administrators and women who control them. It was vivid and lively and gloomy and savage. I've tried to get to know folk, from the barrack room and the brothel to the ballroom and the Viceroy's council, and I have in a little measure succeeded. My training has been extensive and peculiar, and now I'm going to come home and see how it will work. Kipling left Lahore on the 3rd of March 1889, destined for fame and fortune. His reputation would wane with the empire, and his politics would alienate later generations. But it was the stories that grew out of his experiences here in Lahore and in the foothills of the Himalayas and Shimla which remain his masterworks. Works which are far more modern and complex, far more sympathetic to the layers of Indian life than Kipling is usually given credit for. Arriving back home in October, he found that Britain had changed too. The empire was more cherished and celebrated than ever, and the reading public were fascinated to find out what life was really like out in the colonies. Kipling found that his plain tales were a popular as well as a critical sensation. The eternal outsider had discovered a welcoming audience.
People said, now we have somebody who will tell us about India. And there's Oscar Wilde's famous review that when you're reading Plain Tales from the Hills, one feels as if one was sitting under a palm tree, reading by superb flashes of vulgarity. But Kipling was the hottest thing, and Kipling was really the first hottest thing ever, because he arrived in London at a time when mass media were really beginning to be developed, and so he was the first writer to have a kind of global fame. And I think anything he wrote, he could publish, and publishers were just queuing up to publish his work.
It was the boldness of his stories that shocked and enthralled his British readers, and they couldn't get enough.
Think of Lord Byron saying, I was the comet of the season. Rudyard Kipling is the comet of the season. He astonishes everybody because this is a new kind of realism that they haven't known in London. And he really has an astonishing impact.
No writer, not Shakespeare, not Dickens, has ever enjoyed such fame in their own lifetime. After a period in America, he was to live out his life here in the Sussex countryside. He became the literary lion of the empire, as the empire itself fell into decline, and his fame has never waned. Kim, his story of an orphaned boy growing up on the streets of Lahore, would be his literary masterpiece and win him the Nobel Prize. But everything he achieved was founded on his teenage adventures as a cub reporter who broke all the rules, writing short stories that would change forever the way India is imagined.
Bollywood actresses talk about the impact the 90s had on their careers with the BBC Asian network. That's tomorrow at 1. And famous faces try out retirement in India. Catch the Real Marigold Hotel now on BBC iPlayer. Next, though, the most uncomfortable love song ever performed. Nick Helm joins Russell Kane live at the Apollo.